Picture the last time you checked on a sleeping child. Maybe you leaned over a crib. Maybe you glanced at a baby monitor glowing on a nightstand. You listened for breathing. You felt an immediate, involuntary spike of relief when you heard it. That reflex is ancient, but for most of human history, it came with a brutal caveat. In prehistoric populations, anthropologists estimate that roughly 40 to 50% of children died before reaching age 15. In some regions, nearly a quarter of infants didn't survive their first year. Death wasn't a possibility parents planned around. It was a near coin flip they lived inside. And yet, somehow, enough children survived to produce you. Every person alive today descends from an unbroken chain of caregivers who beat those odds, generation after generation, for roughly 300,000 years. This isn't a story about tragedy. It's a story about strategy. Because ancient humans didn't just hope their children survived. They built systems, rituals, and social structures engineered specifically to shift the odds. Understanding those systems changes how you see childhood itself, including your own. Start in Russia, at a site called Sungir, roughly 200 kilometers east of Moscow. In 1955, archaeologists began excavating a burial dated to approximately 34,000 years ago. Inside, they found the remains of two children, one around 10 years old, the other around 12 or 13. They were buried head to head, covered in over 10,000 mammoth ivory beads. To put that in perspective, researchers calculated that producing a single ivory bead using tools available at the time took roughly 45 minutes of skilled labor. 10,000 beads meant an estimated 7,500 hours of collective work, invested in two children's funeral garments alone. This wasn't a society with surplus time. Life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years. Every hour spent carving ivory was an hour not spent hunting, foraging, or making tools that kept the group alive. Yet they spent it anyway, on children who had already died. That single burial tells you something the mortality statistics don't. Children weren't treated as expendable, even in a world where losing them was statistically almost expected. If anything, the opposite seems true. The more precarious a child's survival was, the more ritual and resource ancient communities appear to have poured into protecting and honoring them. But investment after death is one thing. Keeping a child alive in the first place required something far more constant, far more physically demanding, and far stranger than any single burial site can show. Because the deeper question isn't whether ancient humans cared, it's how, mechanically, a species with no medicine, no formal shelter in many cases, and predators actively hunting the smallest and weakest among them, managed to keep enough children breathing to keep the whole species going at all. The answer starts with a number that doesn't show up in most parenting conversations today. 2. Not two parents. 200% more caregivers than the nuclear family model most people grow up imagining. In 2009, anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy published research on what she termed cooperative breeding in early human society. Her argument, built on decades of fieldwork among groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Aka of Central Africa, was direct. Human children were never raised by two parents alone. They were raised by a network. Among the Aka, researchers recorded that infants had physical contact with an average of 14 different caregivers within the first few months of life. Not just mothers, but fathers, grandmothers, older siblings, and unrelated adults. Grandmothers, in particular, showed up as a critical variable. In a landmark 1998 study, anthropologist Kristen Hawkes analyzed Hadza foraging data and found that postmenopausal grandmothers who actively foraged for their grandchildren directly correlated with those children's improved survival rates. She called it the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that menopause itself evolved because older women who stopped reproducing but kept providing food gave their grandchildren a measurable survival edge. This wasn't occasional help, it was structural. In many hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists throughout the 20th century, a child's biological mother provided less than half of the calories that child consumed before age 5. The rest came from the network, a system so consistent across unrelated cultures on different continents that researchers now consider it a core human adaptation, not a cultural preference. But here's where it gets stranger. If cooperative childcare was so essential to survival, evolution should have made it emotionally automatic for everyone, all the time. It didn't, and that gap between what humans needed and what human bodies actually did created one of the strangest workarounds in the archaeological record. Consider the Ache people of Paraguay, studied extensively by anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado starting in the 1980s. Their data revealed something uncomfortable: infanticide, particularly of infants without a clear support network. No father present or born too soon after a sibling to be adequately provisioned occurred at rates anthropologists estimated between 14 and 20% in some traditional age groups before sustained contact with outside society. This wasn't cruelty in the way modern audiences might assume. Hill and Hurtado's interviews suggested it functioned as a brutal calculation, made under conditions of extreme scarcity. A group with limited food, mobility, and caregiving capacity capacity sometimes could not keep every child alive, and decisions were made accordingly, often based specifically on whether the cooperative network, that web of alloparents, was intact. In other words, the very system built to save children was also the system whose absence could doom them. A child without a network wasn't just disadvantaged. In some documented populations, it was often not viable at all. That's not the whole story, though, because if network absence was a death sentence, ancient humans needed more than hoping a village showed up. They needed physical, architectural, and biological adaptations, things built into bodies, camps, and even bones, to keep infants alive when the ordinary safety net frayed. And one of those adaptations is still visible today, on a bone inside your own skull. Look at an infant's skull, and you'll find something adults don't have: soft spots, called fontanelles, where the bone hasn't fused yet. Most people assume this exists purely so the head can pass through the birth canal. That's true, but it's only half the story. In 2017, researchers analyzing infant cranial development pointed to a second function. Fontanelles allow the brain to keep growing rapidly after birth, because human babies are born, by necessity, radically underdeveloped compared to other primates. A newborn chimpanzee's brain is already around 40% of its adult size. A human newborn's brain is closer to 25%. The rest of that growth, the majority of it, happens outside the womb over the first several years of life. This is sometimes called the fourth trimester problem, and it explains something crucial about ancient childcare. Human infants are essentially born premature by primate standards because a human pelvis can only widen so far before it compromises the mother's ability to walk upright. Evolution solved a birth canal bottleneck by shipping the baby out early and finishing construction afterward, outside the body, in the world, dependent entirely on caregivers for a stretch of helplessness longer than almost any other species on Earth. That single evolutionary trade-off is why cooperative breeding wasn't optional. A newborn couldn't cling to fur and self-regulate its temperature the way an infant primate could. It couldn't grip, couldn't thermoregulate well, couldn't do much at all beyond crying and needing to be carried, fed, and kept warm around the clock for years. Multiply that helplessness across multiple children in a group, and you get a survival math problem no single set of parents could solve alone. Except there was a problem even the network couldn't fully fix: disease. At a site called Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, occupied from roughly 7,100 to 5,700 BCE, archaeologists studying skeletal remains found that population density, as humans shifted from small mobile bands to larger settled farming communities, correlated with a measurable rise in childhood mortality from infection. Some estimates place child mortality in early agricultural settlements as high as 30 to 50% by age 5, driven partly by proximity to livestock, stored grain attracting pests, and waste accumulation that mobile foraging groups simply never generated in the same concentrations. In other words, one of the biggest shifts in human history, the invention of agriculture, permanent settlements, food surplus, didn't immediately make childhood safer. In some ways, for a period of several thousand years, it made things worse. Farming solved a caloric problem and introduced a disease problem, and it took millennia, extending into recorded history, before infrastructure like sanitation began to reverse that trade. So the full picture isn't a straight line of progress. It's a series of trade: mobility for calories, small kin networks for defense, fragile skulls left unfused so brains could keep building themselves in the outside world, guarded by a rotating cast of a dozen or more caregivers in a species that gambled, generation after generation, on cooperation being stronger than scarcity.